We have to stop giving permission, even for the threat of violence.
Because in that haystack of apparently disturbed keyboard cowboys is a needle of a shooter who is going to come out of the shadows and ruin lives.
Welcome to the Stakes for Democracy. I'm Brad Rourke with the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan operating foundation that focuses on advancing and defending inclusive democracy. Today, I'm talking to Kettering Senior Fellow and former FBI Director James Comey and former Member of Congress from Maryland, Donna Edwards. Jim, Donna, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Brad.
Thank you, Brad. Good to be with you.
There's a lot to talk about, but let's start with something that's on a lot of people's minds right now, which is political violence. Even before the assassination attempt on the former president, this has been a key topic. James Comey, former FBI director for Obama and briefly famously for President Trump, a mob prosecutor, defense lawyer, aerospace general counsel, author of 4 best-selling books, including the new political thriller Westport. What are you watching in the current threat environment?
I'm very concerned about the threat world becoming the violent act world. That is, troubled people who are part of this ecosystem that thinks it's okay to threaten public officials at all levels, that crossing over from the words to the acts. And so I think of it as lone wolves, disturbed individuals. Unfortunately, I think we saw a bit of that, although we don't know for sure, but we saw it likely in Butler, PA, with the attempt on Donald Trump's life. That crossover is of great concern. I'm less concerned about the idea of organized domestic violence. I think we face significant threats of an organized fashion from overseas. But domestically, it's about the lone wolves moving from talking to acting.
Donna Edwards, you held a congressional seat in Maryland for many years and also campaigned to return famously in an RV throughout your district. Knocking on door after door after door. You were also in your party's leadership structure while in office, and now you're president-elect of the Association of Former Members of Congress. One potential target of political violence is elected officials and members of Congress. How has the threat you and your colleagues and former colleagues faced changed over time?
You know, it's very interesting, Brad. I mean, when we did a survey of former members of Congress, you can point to a time when there really wasn't a lot of reported violence, but something changed, I think, beginning in about 2006, 2008. During the time I served was the rise of the Tea Party movement. There was a lot more confrontation, especially around issues around healthcare and others. And that confrontation started to take place directly against members of Congress at things like town hall meetings, constituent meetings, in district offices. And in my case, because my congressional office was near my congressional district, there were instances where that kind of confrontation came right out from Maryland and the Maryland suburbs into to Capitol Hill. You also have the rise of the internet and social media, which gave people, in a positive way, kind of more access to their elected officials, but it also provided a forum for confrontation that was anonymous, so you didn't know where the threatening language came from, but then that became threatening behavior as well. And as a result, you see many more members of Congress within the last 15 years or so reporting that they have been threatened, that their staff members have been threatened. And I think that this is a relatively new phenomenon.
James Comey, from your standpoint as former FBI director and thinking about the point you made earlier about trying to keep us moving from threat to action, what are the levers that we can push on to mitigate and prevent that movement from threat to action, especially in these sort of specifically political pieces of violence?
Yeah, it's very difficult because the behavior is often, as Donna said, shrouded in the anonymity offered by the internet, and family members may not even know, as appears to be the case in Butler, that someone is headed towards an act of violence. So it's really hard to see flags, and then it's really important to act on them when you see them. And so the most important thing law enforcement can do is talk about the danger of threats being part of our political culture, becoming an enormous fad, especially from the right side of our spectrum, the danger that those pose to us, and then encouraging people to report it. And then every single flag that's reported has to be run down. That's the lesson of school shootings, the lesson of workplace violence. Now, given the environment that Donna talked about, that's a tremendous burden on the FBI and its joint terrorism task forces. But the work has to be done, because in that haystack of apparently disturbed keyboard cowboys sending hard messages, threatening messages to their congressperson, is a needle of a shooter who is going to come out of the shadows and ruin lives.
What about another form of political violence, though, and that's violence that's coming out of large mass behavior? So I'm thinking, of course, about the insurrection on January 6th, and also earlier, the Charlottesville riots. Is there anything that we can do to avoid those kind of interactions?
Well, the most important thing we can do as a country is what we've been doing since January 6th, and that is send a message of deterrence, that if you engage in that sort of behavior, we, the United States of America, will ruin your life. You will go to prison. You'll have fines imposed. You will wear a scarlet letter for all the world to see that you engaged in that kind of behavior. The good news, if there is any good news about the kind of mob activity we saw on January 6th, is that it's made up mostly, not entirely, but mostly of individuals who can be deterred. They're not jihadis looking to lay down their life for an orange god or something. They are people who've been manipulated and defrauded and drawn into a cult-like atmosphere where they're pushed towards engaging in violence. They can be derailed with the fear that is deterrence. So I don't want to suggest that we can rid ourselves of group violence, but we can send a message of deterrence that limits the amount of violence. One. Two, the FBI has to, and I'm sure they are, do a better job, better than they did before January 6th, of understanding the threat and equipping those who defend people and defend physical property to defend. And if we do those two things, a shockwave of deterrence, and then adequately examine the threat and prepare for it, as we do with international terrorism threat, we can make ourselves significantly safer against group violence.
Donna Edwards, in Congress, you are a strong advocate for solutions to domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and I've heard you make analogies to that work when thinking about political violence. Could you draw some of those lines for us?
I think that in order to prevent this kind of political violence, it requires communities to stand up. I think, as Jim has said, that when you have leaders who speak out, when you have law enforcement that acts, when you have neighbors and friends who voice their concerns, that it takes away the permission that's given for even an individual or for groups to act violently. And this is very similar in intimate partner relationships, where part of the reason that violence is allowed to exist is because all of the rest of us around it ignore it and pretend that it doesn't happen or that it's not important. And so I do think it's really important for our leaders, our friends, our neighbors, our community members, some of the folks who engaged in violence on January 6th, during their sentencing hearings, they actually said that they don't have any idea what took over them, that they were moved by other people, that they were incited into their violent behavior. And so, it's not a surprise to me that so many of them were turned in by their friends and their neighbors and their family members who weren't going to tolerate this kind of violence. And so we have to stop giving permission, even for the threat of violence, the language that we use. Let's stop giving permission to that as one mechanism to begin to stop it.
Along those lines, James Comey, I've heard you describe the role of culture in reducing and mitigating this pervasive sort of sense of threats of political violence, especially from the right, but not only. And your analogy involves nuclear physics. Say a little bit more about that analogy.
All right. Nuclear physics, well beyond my expertise, but I like it as a metaphor. In our lifetimes, we have as a country done a good job of controlling, pushing into the basement an aspect of our national life that has always been there, a racist, misogynist, homophobic, anger-driven stew. That's a part of America's existence. It's always been there. I would argue it's part of all countries, but we know America best. And so we've pushed it down into the basement. But I like a nuclear physics metaphor better. What we've done is we've built a containment building around that radioactive stew. That containment building is laws. But in some ways, we've done something as important, maybe more important, and that is we've pushed cultural control rods down into that stew to slow down the radiation, to reduce it, to make it unacceptable to engage in certain patterns of speech, patterns of behavior that reflect that radioactive stew of racism in particular. One of the coolest things that's happened in my lifetime is that the word that is unspoken, especially by white people, it is now the most offensive curse word in America, right? We can say the F word, which I won't say on your podcast, but that's actually far more common today than the N word. That is a great change and a cultural change. And so in all sorts of ways, we've pushed those cultural control rods down in the stew and calmed it a bit. That doesn't mean there aren't racists in there, but when they're public officials, in most of the last 10 or 20 years, they couldn't talk a certain way, they couldn't act a certain way, and that was a healthy thing. But what's happened, as Donna talked about, really since the advent of the Tea Party, is that leaders have slowly urged the withdrawing of those cultural control rods so that certain behaviors that were calmed and pushed down have started to emit radiation, to bang around inside that containment building of law. And that's a very dangerous situation for us because the building of law is only going to take us so far. If we have an explosion, it's going to be blown to bits. And so law has a job to do to maintain that building, but all the rest of us, who make up American culture, are responsible for those control rods that are ultimately our safety.
Donna, are there ways to reinsert cultural control rods into what Jim is describing?
Well, Jim is far more eloquent about this than I am because I usually describe it as the nastiness, the rot that was hiding up underneath the rock, and we need to put it back under the rock. And I think Jim is right that these kind of things have always existed. There have always been a certain percentage of our population that continues to be racist and sexist and misogynist and homophobic and all of the isms. And we had managed to keep them under that rock. And I think precisely because leaders have opened that permission structure, they've loosened those rods, it's allowed that darkness to come out into the light. And I would argue that there might not be anything that we can do with that, sort of 1/3 or 20% of the population that behaves in that way. But what we can do is push it back where it belongs so that it doesn't infect the rest of us. Being careful as leaders about the kind of language that we use and the impact that might have. And after all, what happens in this environment is that the slightest little thing, the slightest breach of language just multiplies in ways that we didn't even imagine in the past, precisely because we have the advent and use of the internet. And so all the more reason that leaders have to be even more careful about our language. And I think if you're in a locker room and you hear that kind of language, you need to stop it in its tracks, because otherwise you do give permission for it to continue to unfold and to potentially result in an act of violence and not just the language of violence.
Kettering Foundation Senior Fellow, former FBI Director Jim Comey, former member of Congress and friend of Kettering, Donna Edwards. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.